Well, welcome. It's great to see so many people here. I have the privilege of being here with our two composers who are having works premiered this week with the American Mavericks series. So Mason Bates, who's here immediately on my right, has the piece Massed Transmission. It was done with the chorus, and Paul Jacobs on organ just last night, and then you, of course, performing. And then John Adams, the piece Absolute Jest, which was also performed last night. And then there'll be one more concert tonight, so if you haven't heard them yet, definitely encourage you to stick around this evening and check this out. But if we're talking about creativity, a great place to start in the musical world is with the people we charge with the responsibility and the challenge of being creative, our composers. And I wondered maybe if each of you could talk a little bit about maybe a key moment in the creation of the works that we've heard this week, where you felt a certain spark, or how does the process of bringing something into being work, and how did it work in these pieces? Mason, you want to start off? It's a small question. It's just a little...
Well, it's funny. I mean, being up here with John, we were in Toronto last year, about a year ago, and John was conducting a piece of mine. And John said, what's the deal with this San Francisco Symphony piece? And I said, I don't know. I had this idea that it was going to be about a transmission of some sort, but I haven't found the text. And John said, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's something like, go far afield for this text, you know? I mean, really look out there in the world, go online, get away from maybe some of the first stops that composers might normally choose, an E. Cummings poem or something. And, you know, he obviously, we think about some of John's recent works involving text, and absolutely that was a very inspiring suggestion. So I decided that instead of doing something relating to the Mass, which had been a first kind of errant thought, I thought, you know, maybe I could look for some example of some kind of transmission to a indigenous place or something. I thought that could be an interesting source of a dramatic idea. And in fact, I ended up finding that with this beautiful story of a mother and daughter communicating between Holland and Java. So, I mean, really, a lot of research had to be done to get to that point. But I really feel like it was John who gave me the courage to look far afield.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the things that's interested me about this notion of the maverick, right? That in some ways you were challenged by another composer to do something unusual, to go further afield. And John, with your piece, I mean, in some ways the ultimate maverick, at least how we look at it in music, Beethoven, right? You're sort of engaging with that legacy that, you know, we often talk about Brahms, you know, the shadow of Beethoven in this issue. But for you, it was quite inspiring to work with the string quartets.
I guess Beethoven was a maverick. The interesting thing about him was that when he got to Vienna, after his youth and early period in Bonn, he was really focused on becoming, you know, the number one figure in a very traditional situation. I don't think he thought of himself as a maverick, but he certainly exploded the comfortable tradition of that milieu. And of course, what happened in the 20th century is that it became required of an artist to always be breaking the mold and always being original, till we got to the point in high modernism where you have a painter like Jasper Johns or a composer like John Cage, where they actually make rules for themselves to ensure that everything in their work is supposedly new. So the whole concept of what's maverick and what's tradition, what's mainstream, is always shifting, and very often it's not a particularly helpful rubric. My piece, I actually cannot remember what gave me the idea of incorporating Beethoven. The piece is about 23 minutes long, and it actually uses only a couple of fragments of Beethoven. I haven't counted them, but I don't think it's more than 8, maybe 10. And they say that when composers reach their late period, they get involved in counterpoint. And so I guess I'm somewhere between Medicare and my late period. Yeah, I don't know what it is about counterpoint, but it really does seem to draw you in your dotage. And you know, of course, that the very, very old Franz Schubert, in the last year of his life, when he was, 29? Actually sought out a counterpoint teacher. And Beethoven, at the end of his life, was absolutely obsessed with counterpoint, particularly in the Missa Solemnis and in the pieces that I drew from, the late quartets, and particularly the Grosse Fuge. So that was very much on my mind. You know, I got the commission from the symphony, and it was the 100th anniversary, and it was, as they say in The Godfather, it was an offer I couldn't refuse because I've been living here for so long, and I have such a long and wonderful history with the San Francisco Symphony. I adore this orchestra. And I adore it more now than I did even in 1981 when they first played a piece of mine. They're just such an amazing group of players. And the thing was that I accepted the commission, but I had no idea what I was going to write. And as Mason will tell you, it's a terrible thing to sign on to something but not really have an idea. And I advise young composers not to accept commissions. You know, if you get a big cash offer waved in front of you, it's hard to say no. But first should come the idea for the piece. Well, fortunately, I came to a concert, probably, I don't know exactly when it was probably spring of 2010 maybe. And I heard MTT do Stravinsky's Pulcinella, which I'm sure everybody here knows, a piece that Stravinsky based on some Neapolitan music, not all of it.
Pergolesi,
not all of it
sure,
by
yeah,
Pergolesi,
yeah.
apparently, but a lot of it. And I thought, well, that's actually a wonderful idea of one composer looking back over a period of 100 or 200 years and internalizing the music. But when the idea of using the Beethoven, of course, using Beethoven is just really suicidal. If you think about it, it's like, you know, trying to play wiffle ball with Barry Bonds, you know. But I did write this piece, and contrary to what you may read, I did not think of this as a comedy. And that's why I use the word jest, because jest, I think, implies something on a higher level of experience. It's a kind of Shakespearean term. I was not intending to, you know, make a laugher, a goofy piece where I'm, you know, poking you in the ribs or something. I'm trying to do something that takes very, very highly recognizable musical signals, like bup, ba-dup. And obviously there's a wink there and there is some humor in it, but weave them, incorporate them into my own musical language, and also give my own sort of spiritual identity to my experience with Beethoven.
Mm-hmm. So Mason, you know, obviously at the beginning of your career, you haven't hit your late period quite yet. And I'm just wondering, with this sort of idea of developing your musical language, I mean, you're trying something very new here, working with a choir for the first time, as I understand it, organ maybe for the first time, and yet you're doing something you've done a little bit before, which is, you know, working in this gap between electronica, between the sort of dance club and the symphony orchestra, sort of trying to bring these at least your own music making in both these worlds together. And that's, I think, one thing a maverick does. I mean, if we look at sort of John putting Beethoven together with his musical language, I mean, it's sort of this collision of different things making something new. And your sort of maverick approach, if you let me go that way, uses a similar strategy. Can you talk about that collision a little bit?
Well, I want to mention a couple of things. Actually, choral music was kind of baked into me because I grew up in a church school where I was doing a lot of choral singing. So, in fact, I'm a sleeper cell choir boy that did not really write a lot of choral music until Chanticleer, our local superstar chorus, asked me to write a few pieces for them a couple of years ago. And that's when Ragnar Bolin, our chorus master, said, hey, we should do something. So, in fact, the actual ensemble was not outside the box for me. I think for me what was a bit outside the box was trying to write a spare piece. I mean, there's a lot of, for me, I feel like I have quite a bit of internal pressure to throw lots of things at the page, and I love that. I love setting hair on fire, and a piece that was here a month ago called Alternative Energy has quite a lot of different stylistic areas that it goes into. I like to have a dynamic piece that really changes the rules of the game. This piece is different for me because it is much more in kind of one breath, and there's really not a whole lot to hide behind. I mean, there's a chorus and there's an organ and there's some electronics, but I felt like it was an intimate story that needed something different from the 80 people that we get in an orchestra. As much as I love the orchestral palette, I wanted something different. And so it was a very direct, emotional story that I came across, this incredible story of this mother and daughter speaking across these 1920s transmission lines between Holland and Java. And I felt like the story that told would need to really have a kind of a dark and mysterious angle to it, but also a very heartfelt side to it. And I have to say that sometimes the thing that is hardest is, in fact, always the thing that is hardest is the simpler thing, and it is always a challenge to go there. I think also that for me, it's great to be on this festival. I mean, Maverick Festival is incredible. There's quite a bit of figuring out, what does the Maverick mean and all that, and sometimes I think one might think about, if you're looking at a painting, is it the amount of paint on the canvas? I like to think about form, and I like to think about what the experience of a piece is, and I feel like sometimes the way that a piece can do something idiosyncratic or different is in the totality of the time that it lasts. Like not necessarily can you grab a sound bite of it and can we do a spectral analysis on that, and does that have X number of dissonant notes at that time? I think also the thinking, for me, thinking about form is something that's very important. I miss that sometimes in even some of the greatest composers that I really love, who have fantastic, absolutely incredibly beautiful sounds or thrilling sounds. Sometimes I feel like I want to have something that starts from the outside, and that was always hard for me too, because I started, like a lot of people, on the piano, and I was governed by my fingers. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay to be the vessel. You need to, I think, as a composer, feel what you're writing. It's always been a challenge to balance the needs of the form with the material that's living inside it. And for this piece, I think that the challenge for me was trying to find this more spare language. That's something I hadn't done. And even though I had very deep feelings about choral music, I hadn't written for an SATB chorus since I was a kid. Writing for Chanticleer is one thing because there are 12 solo voices, and you can, speaking of counterpoint, you can really divided by 12. This is an incredible course, can do so many things, but you don't write for 140 voices the same way. So the challenges of both the ensemble and also some of the things that I set up for myself with the story of the piece were, I think, new confrontations that I've enjoyed dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think with both of your pieces, you work with traditional elements. I mean, so in your piece, Mason, I mean, the choral sound, this hum or haze as you describe, I mean, it also has this just beautiful resonance that uses chords, right? I mean, one way to be a maverick is to just offend your audience, right? To do something radically different, to have someone walk out and just sit in front of a piano for 4 minutes and 33 seconds and confuse everybody. But you both have embraced the audience in a certain way, and I wonder, what is, in this imperative to be creative, how do you conceive of your relationship to your listener? Is that something you think about, or is it when you compose and you have this emotional, poetic idea to communicate, is that something that's really between you and the page, or do you imagine a listener fairly early on in the process? Either of you?
Well, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I can't even believe that people ask this question, but I mean, you're not the first.
I'm a maverick.
But
Crazy question.
I think the fact that the question is out there shines an interesting light on, the perception about contemporary music or contemporary art in general. Do you think about your audience? Of course you think about your audience. Maybe we don't all have a highly focused concept of exactly who our audience is. But I think generally, when I'm composing, I'm basically composing for people who essentially share my sensibilities. I don't mean they have to share my entire knowledge of music or even my preferences, but they're essentially sort of in the same zone that I am. I just can't imagine not thinking about my audience, because to me the act of making music is the act of bringing something out of yourself and bouncing it off someone else. It's like a little kid coming home and saying, "Guess what happened today at school?" It's really no different than that. You want to see how your feelings and your thoughts and your perceptions resonate with other people. Otherwise, it's just would be such an empty experience. I couldn't even imagine doing it. I suppose I could envision some sort of personality for whom the act of creation was so solipsistic and so completely introverted that it was just a kind of matter of problem solving or something like that. But I think even chess masters and nuclear physicists, they want to get their ideas communicated.
I think, in some ways, John Cage is the same idea as well, right? 4 minutes and 33 seconds was a challenge to the audience, was an attempt to get the communication, to get the audience to open up their ears to experience. And, in some ways, whenever we talk about music, we have to talk about listeners.
Cage is always great subject for talk largely because Cage is, his artistic impulse was extremely cerebral. And he viewed music really in a very cerebral way. And he said on several occasions that feelings made him uncomfortable, that he was not even comfortable with his own emotional or feeling life. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the problems with John Cage, with the understanding or the perception or the lack of that with his music, is because people don't experience feeling from it. And music is above and beyond everything else the art of feeling, much more than any other art form. I know a dramatist or a poet or a painter might come and want to take issue with me, but I really think that the reason when we hear a piece, people get really extremely emotionally affected. They can get very angry if it's a very dissonant piece, or they can get incredibly excited, or all turned on by the rite of spring, or patriotic by Fidelio or whatever. But it's because music's getting to them on that fundamental level of feelings, and that's what we do as composers. We really are in the business of communicating feeling.
Well, Michael Tilson Thomas mentioned that a little bit when he said he needed a poetry to be a conductor, that he needed Walt Whitman, and I think it's that same sort of connection about feeling. I mean, Mason, in your piece, that moment when the two choristers break away, and one becomes the daughter as a soloist and one is the mother, I mean, that's a very poignant moment. I don't know if you want to talk about the way in which that dramatizes that expressive motion in the text. It's really...
That was a part of the piece that I was most concerned about, because, at least if you have the chorus and you have the organ, you have the chorus and the organ, but when you suddenly break it down to two people with just some light sort of sounds behind it, it's it's hard. It's really something to just basically work or not. And what was particularly challenging about this part of the piece, in case some of you all haven't heard it, there's a first section that's this mother in the Dutch telegraph office kind of trying to communicate with her daughter. The second section is from her daughter's perspective in Java. And the last part has a little bit of these transcripts from what went on between these people in 1920. The actual transcript, on the surface of it, if you're just skating over the surface of reality, might be rather prosaic. Are you still there, Mom? Yes, my child, that kind of thing. But I found that there was, in that kind of prosaic, almost just sort of like everyday life, what's the weather like? There was great poignancy in that. And when we're Skyping or talking on the phone to someone we love across a great divide, we're generally not saying things like, I'm kissing the face of God, or, I just read all of Kafka. A lot of times you're saying things like, how's it going? Did the baby poop, how's the, baby on the brain, but how, they're basically very prosaic things. And when you get those things down into a situation where people are spread apart, they have a great meaning. And so I thought, for that section, I would try to have two solo voices. And actually, spreading them apart was David's idea, the assistant chorus master. He said, do you mind having a little bit of theater? And, I said, absolutely, let's try it out, let's see if it works. And, having them spread apart physically seemed to work with the piece. And we were lucky to have two people in the chorus who really could drop in for all of, 1.5 minutes and really deliver some kind of like poignant, dramatic lines.
In the concert last night, when that first happened, I was, is she okay? Because she walks sort of out of the hall to get to the other side. And I was like, oh, I hope everything's okay. But it did, which I guess sort of validates the feeling that the audience was really connected to the players as individual human beings. But we're here as part of the American Orchestra Forum, and one of the things I'm curious about is the way, the orchestra seems in some ways like the ultimate challenge to be Maverick, to deal with this intimacy of feelings, and yet to have a box of crayons with 100+ colors in it, with the whole history of music at your disposal as far as things to work with, and still be challenged to do something different. Can you, is it different, or what is the challenge when you're writing for orchestra? Does that affect you in some way? Is there a particular excitement? Do you think of particular ensembles and conductors, or is it something more abstract? John, do you want to tackle that to start?
Well, the orchestra actually is a relatively new medium. kind of formed, at least the history books tell you that it sort of established an identity, the idea of the multiple strings and the woodwinds and brass, and originally just a timpani, if even that, in the Mannheim period, which is a little roughly between the period of Bach and Haydn. And it sort of reached its elephantine apotheosis in this piece that is on the program tonight called Amérique. Although there are larger, more distended pieces, not many.
City Noir.
And you know, it is a strangely arbitrary thing. I mean, that every orchestra in the Western world has basically 4 flutes, 4 clarinets, 6 horns, whatever it is, 16 firsts, 14 seconds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because in a way, it's just basically been through trial and error that's worked out to be a nice balance. But why not 20 oboes and 4 violas? I mean, there are acoustical issues, but there is a certain arbitrary thing about that, and we all as composers occasionally get very frustrated because we want a lot more of a certain kind of instrument, and we couldn't care less about having a section that we don't want. But as a composer, you learn to deal with that, and unfortunately, in this day and age, players are so amazing that you can ask a cellist to play up in the violin range, and they're happy to do it. And also the instruments themselves have developed so that they're very, very flexible, because the French horn or the trumpet or even the clarinet that Beethoven wrote for was a very, very limited instrument. And if you look at a score of a Beethoven symphony or a Mozart symphony, you'll see that the timpani is only playing 2 notes. And when the music modulates in the development section to a remote key, you'll notice that the timpani is not doing anything. And now, like at the end of my piece, Absolute Jest, if any of you come to hear it tonight, you'll notice that the timpani does literally a chromatic scale at the end, because timpanists have become so incredibly virtuoso that they know how to use the pedal, and you can just literally write almost anything you want for them. But with all that said, the orchestra does have limits. And one interesting limit, and I'd be curious to hear your response to this, Mason, is it has a cultural, an iconically cultural signal. I sort of sound like two-bit Jacques Derrida here, but Derrida, not Derrida. Stay away from French. What I mean by that is that when you hear the orchestra, let's say you're in your car and you put your radio on scan, and it goes through 14, pop music station, and then there's CNN, and then there's that, and then suddenly there's the one classical station. And you know how when you hear that, it's suddenly, oh, it sounds like culture, it sounds like somebody with a British accent, And of course, largely that's because the only music you hear on FM radio is very polite classical music from the 19th century that's put there so that it won't disturb anybody. You don't hear Tarangolillo or Amérique. Yeah. If you did, there'd be more traffic accidents. But the thing is, what I'm getting at is that the orchestra, even if it's the Rite of Spring, it has a certain cultural connection. And so that actually, people are driven away by that, particularly young people. They hear it and they think, that's not my world. And so, as a composer, you're kind of having to say, well, I'm going to join that world. I'm going to try to make it fresh, and there are many ways of making it fresh. You can do what Varese did, which is to just turn it into this just wild, seething herd of buffaloes and panting jungles, drums like you hear in an old Cecil B. DeMille movie or something. Or you can do what Ravel does and create some incredibly gossamer, atmospheric, erotic scenario. You can do all these things, but still you're working within a continuum, an acoustical continuum that is so highly defined on a certain cultural level that it does simply scare a lot of people away. And I was amused, I don't know how many of you people read this article in the New York Times, I guess it was in the magazine last week, about the Radiohead composer Johnny Greenwood. It's very, has millions and millions of fans who follow him. And he's become, in his downtime, he's become an avant-garde classical composer. And he writes pieces that are inspired by Penderecki and Bartók and things like that. So he's actually found a way back into this world where we live all the time. And you listen to his pieces and you think, oh yeah, that's Bartók music for strings and percussion and cellist. Or, so it is interesting when a person from the outside world does kind of rediscover this world that we live in, because it is a world of an amazing flexibility and enormous emotional range, which is why we do it. It's why I'm not a rock musician. I'm an orchestral composer, because I just think that the orchestra is capable of such enormous expressive potential.
I mean, it's true. People have this idea. I remember somebody at UC Berkeley telling me, he said, I would never write for orchestra because it's so bourgeois. And, I was like, get real. I mean, I know what you're saying, but there's certainly a vibe to these spaces. And John's exactly right. I mean, there's definitely a cultural history here, and there's a cultural connotation. I think that there's an intimidation factor for a lot of folks that can be dealt with. And I think without really changing the substantive stuff that's happening on the stage, getting information to people in different ways can really help. I remember at the first Mavericks Festival, a great example of this. There were these kind of video program notes during these massive set changes. In fact, San Francisco has done a lot to be on the forefront of this, be it in things like that in the concert setting, or also on their website with keeping score, even little after-hours events like we had last night, where the symphony, the actual place becomes kind of a platform. The truth is, I mean, the orchestra really is alive. I mean, it's changing, and it's not just changing in literal, add instruments ways, such as, add electronics, or John's been using electronic sounds for a long time, or the tuning that came into absolute jest. But even the new sounds that people will make out of 200-year-old instruments, it is changing, and there are new ways of thinking about it. And on the one hand, the orchestra has this connotation. On the other hand, I mean, some of the first music that I heard that had an orchestra involved was like, Pink Floyd, The Final Cut, psychedelic rock. And there's a lot that the orchestra can do. The great pieces of music history sometimes, I think, take a little bit more kind of an acquired taste to truly appreciate. But if you're alive, you will be moved by this music. And I think that if people here, I imagine it's a pretty sympathetic crowd to it, but for folks that feel like it's somehow culturally outside of their realm, I think there's a lot of mind-blowing music, definitely beyond what's on FM radio, and certainly with festivals like this, it's a great way to remind people that that's the case. It's true, something like an orchestra is an institution. I mean, it takes quite a lot of cooperation to make it happen. I remember a visual artist friend said, man, y'all have a level of communication, a level of cooperation in your field that is unheard of. And it's true. I mean, just look at the amount of people that have to work together. It's incredible. There has to be an institution to support that, and it might not, you know, be able to, you know, change on a dime, but things are really changing, and I feel like, particularly here, and, you know, particularly West Coast orchestras have been amazing at really adapting to the kind of 21st century audiences. So I think it can happen. I think it is happening.
Well, in some ways, I think the best answer to this question that both of you have already given happens on stage tonight with the performances of Absolute Jest and Mass Transmission. I mean, for me, both of them really sort of answer the call of Charles Ives of this maverick combination of old and new, of European tradition, of sort of your own thinking and vision, drawing from popular culture, drawing from classical culture. So I think both of you reaching around those issues. And the fact that each of you have very different pieces performed on this stage that sort of bring that together in this synthetic way that really connected with me, certainly me as an audience member last night, is a great testament to the potential of this orchestra, even at its 100th birthday. This sort of Maserati of an instrument to really carry that forward. So thank you so much.
Hey,
and thanks for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.